You can check off all the boxes, but if you're not doing those things, you're not pleasing God. You're not doing what God requires. One of the things I do when I study the Bible is I just write down observations that I make. So I'm reading a verse, and I'll just have all kinds of observations that I write down. I want to share two of those with you this morning from Micah 6:8. The first is this. These verses are a correction for those who are self-righteous and a prescription for those who want to be righteous. Okay, so let's start with the self-righteous. Sometimes we can get in a place where we think we're doing pretty good. Have you ever been here? Man, I'm really knocking it out of the park right now. God must be so impressed with me. Yeah, I'm reading my Bible every day. I'm praying every day. I've been at church 3 weeks in a row. And one of those weeks, I put something in the offering box. I am really doing well. And to those of us who feel self-righteous, who feel like we're doing well, God would say, you need to check yourself against Micah 6:8, right? Because Micah 6:8 says what really matters is to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God. And the other side of that coin is, if I'm thinking to myself, I don't know that I'm doing really well right now. I don't know that I'm living really righteously right now. I want to do better. I want to please God. I want to do what God requires. Well, then here's the prescription. Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with God. Jesus talked about this in Matthew 23. So Matthew 23 is one of those chapters where we see a side of Jesus we don't see very often. All right, we usually think of Jesus as very soft-spoken, kind of meek and mild, loving and kind, and he was all of those things all of the time, but sometimes he didn't really manifest it the way we expect him to, and Matthew 23 is one of those times. He's addressing the Pharisees and the scribes, who are the religious leaders of the day. They're like the pastors, right? They're the ones who have dedicated their lives to learning the Bible. And they know the Bible better than anybody else does. They're trying their very best to live by the Bible and to teach the people how to live by the Bible. And yet Jesus spends all of Matthew 23 telling them they're doing it wrong. He says over and over, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. And then he has fun names for them. He calls them blind guides. At one point, he calls them snakes and vipers, which remember last week, snakes are our enemy, right? And essentially what Jesus is saying is, you guys are the descendants of the original serpent. Now imagine that. Imagine Jesus coming into our church and confronting me and saying, David, you're a descendant of Satan. That would be pretty shocking. That's what Jesus is doing in Matthew 23. And so he gets to verse 23, and he says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. That's one of those insults none of us ever want to hear. Nobody wants to be called a hypocrite. But he says, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin. Picture this, right? These are spices. This is what the Pharisees were doing. They'd go home and they'd get the spice rack out. They'd pull their spices out. And they'd dump them out and measure them on a scale. See how much they had. The reason being, because in the Old Testament, it says you are to tithe 10% of everything you have. And so in their mind, what that meant is, I've got to give 10% of everything I have to God. And so they were actually measuring out their spices to figure out how much was 10% and then bringing 10% of their spices to the temple. Now that's devotion. I don't think anybody this morning opened the cabinet and said, let's give some Lowry's seasoned salt to the church today. Right? How much of this bottle is 10%? Nobody did that today, right? Nobody's that devoted to tithing. And that's okay, you don't have to be. One of the reasons that they did this was because they were so desirous of impressing people. They wanted everybody else to look at them and say, wow, those guys, man, they are so devoted. They're even tithing their spices. That is impressive. But Jesus says to them, you tithe your spices, and you've neglected the weightier measures of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. Jesus is actually quoting Micah 6:8 here, because the Pharisees knew Micah 6:8. What Jesus is saying to them is, you guys, you've got your checklist, right? Your righteousness checklist. You're just going down your checklist and checking everything off and think you're doing so amazing. Did you forget what Micah said? Did you forget what God said he requires in Micah? Justice, mercy, faithfulness. You can check off all the boxes, but if you're not doing those things, you're not pleasing God. You're not doing what God requires. And that kind of leads us into the second observation I have from this verse, and it's this, that these verses are not the gospel, but they reveal our need for the gospel. You see, Micah 6:8 cannot save you. You cannot earn God's favor or God's forgiveness by keeping Micah 6:8. And the reason being because none of us can keep Micah 6:8 perfectly. Okay, there are times in my life when I do justice, right? I treat other people with justice. And there are times when I don't. And there are some times in my life, this is my weak spot. There are some times in my life when I'm a kind person, when I'm a merciful person. But that doesn't come naturally for me. And so there are times in my life when I'm not very merciful at all. And there are times in my life when I do walk humbly in the same direction as God. And there are times in my life when I lean on my own understanding and go my own way. And do you understand, if I'm looking at Micah 6:8, and I'm saying, if I can just do this, then God will like me. If I can just do this, then God will accept me. If I can just do this, then God will forgive me. Then God will never like, accept, or forgive me because I can't do this. If I'm banking on my own ability to save me, it's a lost cause because I will mess up. You see, but what this reveals is it reveals my need for the gospel. It reveals my need for someone else to step in and do for me what I can't do for myself. God's requirement is justice, kindness, and walking humbly with him, faithfulness. That's God's requirement. I can't meet God's requirement. I need someone who can, and that's Jesus. Because Jesus came, and for his entire life, he always acted with full justice all the time. He always gave full kindness, full mercy all the time. His life was characterized as one who humbly walked with God. He perfectly met God's requirements. And what he does for me is he takes his perfection and he credits it to my account. So that when God looks at me, he doesn't see someone who misses the requirements, but he sees Jesus hitting the requirements for me, and that's credited to me as righteousness.